David sat in the dimly lit waiting room, his eyes flickering across the sparse and outdated surroundings. The faded wallpaper, peeling slightly at the edges, seemed to whisper of time long past. Mismatched furniture, worn and sagging, gave the space a feeling of quiet discomfort. A low wooden table sat beside his chair, its surface cluttered with a few scattered women's magazines, their pages curling with age. From a speaker mounted high on the wall, soft classical music drifted through the room, too faint to drown out the muffled voices murmuring beyond the closed door. The sound did little to soothe the weight pressing on David's chest. It only served to accentuate the awkward silence stretching between him and the ticking clock on the wall. The minutes dragged painfully, stretching into an endless loop of waiting. Finally, the door opened. Susan stepped inside, her movements hesitant, her expression uncertain. Her lips twitched into a weak smile as their eyes met for a fleeting second before David turned away abruptly, as if her gaze burned him. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The silence between them had become heavier in the past few days, a presence in itself, and today would be no different. The room had 6 chairs, yet Susan chose the one beside him. She sat with a soft sigh, her posture poised yet uneasy, as if she was trying to make her presence feel natural despite knowing it was an intrusion. "Thank you for coming, David," she said softly. Her voice was calm, but laced with something fragile, an underlying nervousness. "I hope Dr. Mars can help us find a way forward, to move on." David remained rigid, his gaze fixed on the floor, refusing to acknowledge her words. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. It made it painfully clear that he no longer believed in the possibility of reconciliation. To him, this meeting was nothing more than an obligation, a waste of time. Just as Susan seemed ready to say something more, the door to the adjoining room opened. A woman stepped out, her eyes red and swollen, her breath coming in uneven bursts. She clutched an embroidered handkerchief in trembling fingers, dabbing her cheeks hastily as if trying to erase the evidence of her distress. With quick, almost frantic movements, she lowered her head and hurried toward the reception door, disappearing in a rustle of fabric and whispered footsteps. A thick silence settled in the room in her wake. Moments later, another figure entered, moving with brisk efficiency. She was a short, full-figured woman clad in a loose brown jumper that draped over her frame, its shapeless form emphasizing her sagging chest and rounded belly. An old-fashioned green skirt fell to her midcalf, and her practical brown shoes made not a sound against the floor. Everything about her was plain, from her unpainted face to the way she carried herself, detached, impassive, unreadable. "Mr. and Mrs. Stillwell's." Her voice was flat, devoid of warmth or irritation. "I'm Dr. Fran Marks. Thank you for coming today. Please follow me into my office." She didn't wait for a response, simply turning on her heel and striding toward the door. Susan stood quickly, her heart pounding. She hesitated just long enough to glance back at David, searching for something, reassurance, familiarity, anything, but found only indifference. He sighed heavily before rising from his seat, his movements sluggish with reluctance, and followed them into the office. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The space was large yet impersonal, dominated by a massive wooden desk at its center. Dr. Marks took her seat at one end, placing her elbows on the surface and interlocking her fingers. Her gaze flickered between them, sharp yet calm, carrying an air of quiet authority. "Let's begin," she said, her voice measured and professional. "From what I understand, the court ordered this consultation at Susan's lawyer's request after you, David, filed for divorce. Have I outlined the situation correctly?" Both nodded simultaneously, and Susan was the first to speak, stepping forward with barely concealed desperation. "I really hope you can help David see reason, Dr. Marks," she said, her voice trembling. "I want him to come home to me, to the children. I don't want a divorce. His parents, my parents, our friends, everyone agrees that he should stop this and come back. They all want us to stay together." David remained motionless. His arms crossed over his chest. His expression was carved from stone. The words she spoke, pleas of love, of family, bounced off him as if they meant nothing. Dr. Marks turned her attention to him. "And you, David, why are you here today?" His gaze lifted to meet hers, tired and emotionless. "Because the judge said I had to be," he replied simply. "I see." Dr. Marks tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Well, this is our first session, and we have 11 more to go. Hopefully, throughout these sessions, we can work through the issues between you and find a way to move forward, whether that means together or separately, in a way that is healthier for both of." Eyebrows knitted in confusion. Sensing something deeper beneath the surface, David raised his wrist slightly and glanced at his Apple Watch. He tapped it a few times, ensuring Dr. Marks was paying attention. His voice, steady yet laced with frustration, cut through the tense air. 5 weeks ago, Friday night, he took a measured breath. "I came home from work, and he jerked his chin towards Susan, his eyes dark with restrained emotion, was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in her hand, waiting for me." The memory played out in his mind as if it had happened just moments ago. "It took me about 20 seconds to realize something was wrong. Then she told me we needed to talk." He exhaled slowly, as if the weight of that conversation still pressed on his chest. "She asked me to sit down. So, I poured myself a drink and sat across from her." His gaze hardened, the betrayal cutting fresh once more. "And then she told me." His voice was calm, almost chilling in its precision. "She had already agreed to go on a date with another man, and she was going out with him the next night." He let the words settle in the air, then added with deliberate slowness, "And if things went well, she might not come home until Sunday." David paused, his eyes locked onto Dr. Marks's, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then, with quiet resolve, he continued, "So, Dr. Marks, that was the news I got when I came home that Friday night." His voice remained even, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. "I'm not a genius, but even I could figure out what that meant." His jaw tightened, his next words sharp, with the edge of realization. "In that moment, I knew. If my wife was planning to spend the night with another man, then she didn't love me anymore." Across the room, Susan reacted instantly, her voice rising in a mix of anger and desperation. "I didn't do anything. I didn't go on a date. I didn't sleep with anyone." Her breath hitched, frustration spilling over. "And you? You left me. You filed for divorce. Even though I didn't do anything. How many times do I have to say it?" David didn't flinch. His expression was unreadable, his posture unwavering. Dr. Marks, sensing the rising tension, intervened. "David," she said, her voice calm but firm, "Susan says she didn't go on the date, that she didn't cheat on you." David's jaw clenched. His voice was cool, measured. "She intended to, and she expected me to just accept it." His fingers curled into fists at his sides, the memory sharp as a blade. "After I packed up and left, she claimed she canceled the date and spent the whole weekend trying to find me." His eyes narrowed slightly. "But I don't know if that's true. And honestly, it doesn't matter." His voice dropped lower, steady as stone. "What matters is that she intended to sleep with someone else. Because I wasn't enough for her anymore." A sharp gasp escaped Susan's lips, her face twisting with shock and hurt. "I never said that." David's eyes were cold, his reply merciless. "You didn't have to say it. Your intentions were clear." His voice was unwavering. "You didn't need to speak it out loud. You showed me in everything you said, everything you did." He exhaled sharply, bitterness laced in his words. "You humiliated me." Dr. Marks leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "I understand why Susan's actions upset you, David, but she didn't follow through with it. She canceled the date. Don't you think that deserves some credit?" David was silent for a moment, his gaze locked on her, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his words slicing through the room like a blade. "That's like saying I deserve credit for not robbing the bank next door." His voice was flat, matter of fact. If I plan a robbery, get the getaway car, buy the mask, write the note, and hand it to the teller, but then walk away when the teller refuses. He let the question linger. It doesn't change the fact that I was planning to rob the bank. Dr. Marks leaned back in her chair, absorbing his words, her expression thoughtful. Silence stretched between them before she spoke again, her voice slow, reflective. I've been doing this for 17 years, she murmured. And I've heard similar arguments before. I've tried to defend spouses who backed away from their plans to cheat because, in the end, they remained faithful to their marriage. She exhaled softly, shaking her head. But, David, I'm struggling to find flaws in your reasoning. She folded her hands on the desk. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't make legal judgments. But I do know this. Intent to rob a bank is still a crime, even if you don't manage to take the money. David nodded slightly, satisfaction flickering in his eyes. Susan, now visibly shaken, trembled as tears welled up in her eyes. The weight of the conversation pressed down on her, leaving her breathless. Her hands shook as she gripped the arms of her chair, her voice breaking into a whisper. What's happening? Her words barely made it past her lips, filled with disbelief and desperation. What does a bank robbery have to do with us? Dr. Marks lifted a hand for silence. David, explain it to her. David's gaze didn't waver. His tone was calm, but there was no softness left in it. Susan, you developed an interest in another man. Maybe you had lunch together. Maybe more. But that interest grew. And then you agreed to go on a date with him. You even planned to spend the night with him. His eyes never left hers. You confirmed your intentions by telling me about it. Susan opened her mouth to protest, but he raised his hand, silencing her before she could speak. You were so sure of what you were doing that you told me you might not come home until Sunday. His voice was steady, unyielding. You made it clear that your intentions were no longer to stay committed to me. The fact that you canceled doesn't erase the fact that you planned it. His next words were final, weighted with undeniable truth. If you loved me, you never would have agreed to go on that date. But you did. His voice didn't waver. And that means you don't love me the way I loved you. A silence, thick and suffocating, settled over the room. Then David stood. His expression was resolute, his heart heavy but firm. I'm sorry, Susan, but I can't stay married to someone who doesn't love me enough to stay away from men with those kinds of intentions. Susan's body shook with silent sobs as she collapsed into her chair, grief overtaking her. David turned, his steps slow but certain as he walked toward the door. Dr. Marks stood as well, extending her hand. Thank you for coming today. Her voice was soft, yet professional. I'll inform the judge that there's no need for additional sessions for you. Then, she turned to Susan, her gaze sympathetic but firm. I think I'll need to spend a little more time with your wife, she said gently, offering her a comforting look. David gave one final lingering glance at Susan, the woman he had loved, the woman who had once been his world. Then, without another word, he walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Susan alone with the cold truth.